The central claim of Christianity is that Jesus is God, and one of the reasons people believe this is because they believe he rose from the dead. The Apostle Paul wrote that if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is futile, or in other words, if the resurrection didn't happen, then the Christian faith collapses. But if the resurrection did happen, then there is good reason to believe that Jesus really is God and adjust your life accordingly. So over the past couple of weeks, we have been looking at different lines of evidence, historical evidence for Jesus's death and the empty tomb. And in this video, we're going to explore the third major line of historical evidence for the resurrection, which is the resurrection appearances. And so here's what I mean when I say the resurrection appearances. It is that Jesus was crucified and he died on a Friday. And then before sundown, his body was taken, wrapped in burial linens with spices, and sealed and buried in a tomb. And then by Sunday morning, his followers found that tomb empty, and that they then believed later that day he started appearing to different people over a period of 40 days, including individuals and groups. Paul summarizes this in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me." So a good question, I think, is what evidence is there for this claim? And actually, I think there's a lot. So the first thing is that these resurrection appearances are recorded by multiple sources. This includes Christian sources like Paul's letters, including the text that we just read, and they report the appearances to different individuals and groups, and even more than the 500 people at once. And then the Gospels also record multiple appearances of the risen Jesus, including details like him eating with his disciples and him showing his wounds to Thomas. But there are non-Christian sources too, including Josephus and Tacitus and Pliny the Younger. And while they don't claim that Jesus rose from the dead, they do confirm that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that his believers believed he had risen and were worshiping him as God for that reason. So I've spent a lot of time in past videos discussing the reliability of the New Testament authors, as well as these external sources, so I'm not going to spend time there. But one point I will reiterate is that these biblical texts were written early enough that there were eyewitnesses around who could have disputed these claims, but they chose not to. So in fact, the gospel authors often identify these witnesses by name, inviting others to verify their accounts, which, is just not something you typically do when you are making up a story. A second piece of evidence for the resurrection is the transformation of Jesus's disciples. So while they had been loyal to him during his ministry, when he was arrested, they abandoned him and went into hiding. Even Peter, who, was Jesus's main disciple, he denied Jesus 3 times the night that he was arrested, saying he didn't know him because he was aware that his association with Jesus could put him in danger of his own arrest and death. But then something changed in their behavior, right? Those same disciples who went from hiding then to proclaiming Jesus' resurrection in public spaces, despite knowing that they would face this intense opposition from both Jewish and Roman authorities. And many of them were persecuted for their faith and even murdered. Peter, for example, the one who denied Jesus, he was reportedly crucified upside down in Rome. A second piece of evidence for the resurrection is the transformation, not just of Jesus' disciples, but also of the skeptics, people who doubted Jesus' deity or even persecuted his followers. So one example is the disciple Thomas, who after Jesus was arrested, he refused to believe in the resurrection and said, "I won't unless I can touch his wounds myself." And then Jesus appears to him and invites him to touch the holes in his hand and his side, and Thomas becomes a committed follower and a public proclaimer of Jesus' resurrection. And according to early Christian tradition, Thomas later traveled to India to preach, and because of his preaching, he was killed there, reportedly being killed with a spear. There's also Jesus' brother, James, who was initially skeptical of Jesus' ministry, and according to historical sources, including Josephus, James later became a leader in the Jerusalem church, And similarly, early Christian tradition says that he was martyred. He was executed by stoning for his role in the Christian community. But the best example of a skeptic, I think, is Paul. He was someone who actively persecuted Christians in Jerusalem. He arrested Christians, he brought them to prison, and he even approved of the stoning of Paul, who was one of the first leaders of the early church. Stephen. Paul persecuted Stephen. And then Paul even went on to get authorization to go and arrest Christians in other cities as well. So like Acts 8 describes someone as Paul who ravaged the church. And yet, after an encounter with the risen Christ, when Paul was traveling on the road to Damascus, Paul then became one of Christianity's, most influential missionaries, preaching the resurrection despite constant danger, writing a good chunk of our New Testament, and this all led to his martyrdom as well. So these transformations, both of followers and of skeptics, they highlight a consistent pattern that individuals who had every reason to hide or disbelieve or oppose the resurrection then became willing to endure hardship and persecution and death because of their conviction that they had encountered the risen Jesus. Okay, so this all builds to a fourth line of historical evidence for the Christian claim of Jesus' resurrection, and that is the rapid growth of Christianity in the first century. So when Jesus died, his followers were few in number, they were scattered, they were under threat from both Jewish and Roman authorities, and Christianity really should have fizzled out when Jesus died. Instead, within a generation, Christian communities had spread throughout the Mediterranean, from Judea and Galilee to Asia Minor and Greece and Rome. And this growth occurred despite significant obstacles that we've already talked about, including persecution and social ostracism and just general hostility of the Jewish and the Roman leaders towards the movement. So early Christians were often from modest social backgrounds, and the movement, it didn't have the political or military power to enforce its message. And despite this, the faith grew quickly. It attracted people from different cities and different cultures and different social classes. And historians note that this type of rapid expansion is difficult to explain just through social or political or economic incentives alone. So the most plausible explanation, in theory, is that the earliest Christians were deeply convinced of the truth of their message, that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that this motivated them to risk hardship and even death to tell others about it. Okay, so now that you know what the Christian claim is and why people believe that there's good evidence for it, I want to now look at the different alternative theories that are in circulation today. So one of the alternative theories is that the resurrection story is really just a legend that developed gradually over time. It became more elaborate as time went on, and as people passed it down. But there are a few reasons why historians find this difficult to accept. And the first is one I mentioned in the last video, is that legends typically develop over centuries and generations, but the earliest accounts we have of the resurrection, like Paul's letter, like that text we read earlier, that was written within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' death. And non-Christians also reference Christians' belief in the resurrection, including like Josephus and Tacitus, and those were recorded about 60 to 85 years later. So it's just too early for stories to have evolved into legends through repeated retelling. Second, the gospel accounts often include embarrassing or difficult details like the disciples' fear or their doubt, their misunderstandings. And so if the story were just legend, we would expect earlier sources to present the disciples as uniformly heroic rather than confused or frightened or skeptical. It's just not what you put in a legend. Also, the legend theory doesn't explain the rapid expansion of Christianity or the willingness of early followers, including skeptics like Paul, to face persecution and death for their belief in the resurrection. So not the best theory. Another alternative theory is that the resurrection claim was just a fraud, just a conspiracy, that Jesus' followers deliberately fabricated the story in order to convince others that Jesus had risen when he had not, when they knew he had not. But historians find issues with this theory too. And the first is that disciples had nothing to gain, either monetarily or materially or politically, by saying that he had risen. In fact, the opposite was true, right? When they said that he had resurrected, they put themselves in danger of imprisonment and death. Second, what we already talked about is that the earliest followers were described in the Gospels and Acts as frightened, confused, and often skeptical of the resurrection themselves. So it's challenging to reconcile that these timid, grieving individuals could invent a story so bold, maintain it under extreme pressure, and then publicly proclaim it in the face of threats and martyrdom. The conspiracy theory also doesn't account for the skeptics we talked about, right? Why would people like Paul and James, who initially opposed the movement, then become these prominent leaders in the church after encountering Jesus, if that had never happened? So if the resurrection claims were a deliberate deception, it's just difficult to explain why former opponents would join in and risk their lives for a known lie. The third alternative theory is that Jesus's followers genuinely did believe that he had risen, but they believed that he rose spiritually rather than physically. According to this view, the disciples and early followers interpreted visions of Jesus as evidence of his resurrection without claiming that he had been bodily raised. Again, historians have several reasons why they question this explanation. First, that the earliest sources, including Paul's letters, emphasize that Jesus did appear bodily, that he could be touched, that he ate with his disciples, that he showed people his crucifixion wounds. So these accounts were not simply spiritual or metaphorical encounters. A second reason is that the appearances are rooted in multiple people and groups, including large gatherings we talked about, rather than just private visions. And so collective experiences of this sort are difficult to explain purely as individual symbolic interpretations. Third, the theory conflicts with Jewish expectations of the resurrection at that time. So first century Jews did believe in the resurrection, but they thought that it would occur at the end of time for the righteous people to collectively resurrect, not individually, not sporadically. And so claiming that Jesus had already been raised as an individual event, that required his followers to reinterpret their long-standing beliefs. And they came to understand Jesus' resurrection as a historical bodily event that had already happened and that he was the first of many to be raised. And this reinterpretation helps explain why, early Jewish followers were willing to proclaim the resurrection publicly and endure persecution for it. Finally, the visionary theory does not fully account for the transformation of early skeptics like Thomas, like James, like Paul, who went from doubting or opposing the movement to then, boldly preaching the resurrection. Taking it a step further, the next popular alternative theory to the resurrection appearances is that they were just hallucinations brought about by grief and extreme emotional distress. And according to this view, the disciples and other followers did experience visions of Jesus because they were mourning his death, and these psychological responses were interpreted as encounters with the risen Christ. But this explanation is also considered unlikely by historians as well as medical experts. Hallucinations are typically private and subjective experiences. There is no known phenomena at all where multiple people simultaneously experience the same detailed hallucinations, let alone a crowd of 500. So hallucinations just can't account for the resurrection appearances to groups of people, crowds of people, all experiencing the same encounter. As well, the hallucination theory doesn't explain why skeptics like Paul, who are not even close to Jesus and not grieving, also experienced this intense transformation after encountering the risen Jesus. It also doesn't account for why early Christians were willing to endure persecution and imprisonment and death for their belief in the resurrection, again and again. So the last major alternative theory is called the cognitive dissonance or wish fulfillment theory. And this is suggesting that the resurrection appearances were psychological in nature again, and according to this theory, the disciples and the early followers experienced visions or beliefs in the resurrection because they were unable to accept that Jesus' death happened, and they wanted to reconcile their hopes with reality. So for the reasons we've already talked about, historians and medical professionals find this explanation unlikely. The theory does not explain the skeptics becoming believers. It doesn't explain the appearances across multiple people and groups over time. It doesn't account for the radical transformation and behavior among early believers. So individuals who were afraid or skeptical or hostile became willing to preach the resurrection publicly and endure persecution or death. It is just difficult to see how mere wishful thinking or cognitive dissonance would produce such consistent and sustained and risky behavior across a wide range of people. So in the end, all of these alternative theories face significant challenges in explaining the historical evidence for the resurrection. The earliest accounts consistently report that people, this includes both his followers and the skeptics, claim to have seen Jesus alive and well after his death. The reported appearances continue to be the central piece of evidence for the resurrection. And while historians continue to, debate how to best understand these claims, what is clear is that they were powerful enough to convince individuals and groups, transform skeptics into leaders, and fuel the rapid spread of the Christian movement in the first century up to present time. For Christians, these appearances provide good reason to believe that Jesus really did rise from the dead and that he really is who he says he is, God. Okay, so in the comments, I would love to know what you think. Based on just the evidence alone, which theory do you think best explains the resurrection appearances? And also in the comments, if you have questions about this or about Christianity in general, go ahead and put them there and I'll try to respond there or in a future video. And if you would like to see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe and I'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you so much.